in the past, prior to last summer of 2006, those who were defending the official conspiracy theory, for the most part, ignored our claims, didn't try to debunk us, just called us names and ridiculed us, saying, that's ridiculous, you're conspiracy theorists, and ignoring the fact they were defending the original 9/11 conspiracy theory. But last summer, 4 major reports came out. A story in Vanity Fair. Kanan Hamilton put out a new book, the chair and the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was given the job of explaining why the 3 World Trade Center buildings came down, had issued its report in 2005, but it didn't answer many questions. So they put out a new document called Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, in which they explicitly tried to debunk the idea that the towers were brought down by explosives. And then finally, Popular Mechanics turned its 2005 article into a book called Debunking 9/11 Myths, and dealt with those issues, but also with the Pentagon and Flight 93. So the 4 chapters in my new book debunk the attempt of those reports to debunk the main claims of the 9/11 Truth Movement.
You mentioned in the intro to your new book, Debunking 9/11 Debunking, that this book, according to them, has been written for the masses, not those that have been investigating this for some time. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, and that's certainly the case, because they use all sorts of deception in there, so that the readers who aren't familiar with the facts are quite often very impressed. And you can read their reviews, customer reviews on Amazon.com, and you see a lot of people give Popular Mechanics book 5-star reviews and say, well, that takes care of it, But the people in the movement who know the facts are not impressed at all. And of course they know that it won't impress us because they know they're cheating. For example, in one place they're arguing there was not a stand down of canceling standard procedures between the FAA and the military, that it was just because the FAA was so late in notifying the military. And also, they claimed the military no longer keeps armed fighters on alert. And they quoted to that effect former Senator Warren Rudman. But they quoted that from a story in the Boston Globe. And after Rudman had said, we simply don't keep armed fighters on 24-hour alert anymore, the Boston Globe writer went on to say, but at Otis Air National Base, we have something pretty close to that, and then actually said they keep armed fighters on alert 24/7, 365 days a year. So the Popular Mechanics pretended like the article ended there, and didn't quote the statement in which the writer directly contradicted Rudman. Well, in every section of the book, they cheat that way. And so unknowing readers would think, oh, that's a knockout punch. But if you know the facts, so I've said Popular Mechanics, they subtitle their book, Why Conspiracy Theories, meaning our alternative conspiracy theory, can't stand up to the facts. And I said the real subtitle should be Why the Alternative Conspiracy Theory Can't Stand Up to the Facts, if we at Popular Mechanics are allowed to determine what the facts were.
So what is a conspiracy theory, according to the dictionary for that matter?
Yeah, this is the most amazing thing, and the reason I put this in the subtitle is because a conspiracy theory, if you look in the dictionary, it just says an agreement in secret to do something illegal or treacherous. So we read about conspiracy theories every day in the newspaper. People conspire to rob banks. Corporations conspire to defraud their customers. Presidents conspire with members of the administration to present false evidence for going to war. our newspapers, our news stories are full. Everybody is a conspiracy theorist. We believe all sorts of conspiracies, and we're right. A lot of these conspiracy theories were true, and yet they keep labeling us conspiracy theory, because instead of using the generic meaning, they take up a very particular meaning in which conspiracy theory means a theory that's irrational, unscientific, kooky, where you start with your premise and then muster the facts to support the premise rather than starting with the facts and then making an inference. And the other thing I show in the book is that insofar as they describe conspiracy theories in that derogatory way, it's the official theory, not us, that follow that method. I show that particularly with Kane and Hamilton. They lay out 5 criteria of what they call conspiracy theories. So that means a disdain for the facts, starting with a theory rather than the facts. And I show that's exactly what they do. For example, they admit that when they began the 9/11 Commission, they had these various teams. They assigned each team a certain task. One team was given the task of describing Al-Qaeda's most successful attack operation, the attacks of 9/11. Well, if that isn't starting with a theory, what is? And then ignoring facts.
Such as some of the hijackers that were reportedly found alive, and also some strange occurrences as well from relatives of the suspected hijackers as well.
All of these facts, they never mentioned them. And a lot of people know those, but a fairly new fact that I hadn't known when writing earlier books was that the web page for Osama bin Laden on the FBI's most wanted pages does not mention 9/11. It says he's wanted for these other terrorist attacks, no mention of 9/11. So Ed Haas, who writes the Muckraker report, called up the FBI and asked, why isn't Osama wanted for 9/11? The guy says, the FBI has no hard evidence that Osama bin Laden was involved in 9/11. Well, you don't read that in your newspapers. You don't see that on the evening news. The 9/11 Commission report didn't report that, even though it was brought to their attention by the families of the 9/11 Commission that were feeding them questions saying, we want answers to these questions. They just ignored that one. It was reported by a very reputable European reporter. It was supported by a British reporter of high repute. The story was that Osama bin Laden was being treated in the American hospital in Dubai by an American doctor and was visited by the local CIA agent at the time. And this was, Osama bin Laden was already America's most wanted terrorist in the summer of 2001. So again, the 9/11 Commission, had they thought they could debunk that story, would have done so. They don't mention it. So my second book was called The 9/11 Commission, Omissions and Distortions. And I documented 115 cases in which facts that we had reported in the 9/11 Truth Movement that challenged the official story were either ignored by the Commission, that was like 99% of them, and then a few where they thought they could debunk it, appear to debunk it by distorting the facts, they did it. In the meantime, I've become aware of maybe another 50 or so omissions and distortions. So that book is just a complete whitewash, a complete distortion of the truth, just a deliberate cover-up. As you read my work through and compare it with the Commission report, it's so obvious. And it's so obvious with these other reports, the report put out by NIST, that they're simply ignoring all the empirical evidence that they can't handle.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned your previous books, because I want to get to the new information that has come out about 9/11 pertaining to the NORAD tapes that were released last year in 2006. But before we do that, let's go back to some of your previous work just to give a brief overview of what it is to someone who may be watching this interview for the first time and thinking, well, this guy sounds like a conspiracy theorist, and those people usually talk about aliens, Bigfoot, and the such. I haven't found any of that information in your books, and I hope you can qualify how that's different than a typical conspiracy theorist piece of fiction, if you will.
My focus all along has been on the evidence that the official conspiracy theory is false. Now, people always want to ask me questions. Well, what do you think really happened? What do you think really hit the Pentagon? I don't know. Yeah. What do you think happened to Barbara Olson? I don't know.
Why don't you blame everything on the Zionists, David?
I would like to have an investigation so I would know what happened to all those. Right. So it would be better to call me an anti-conspiracy theory, because I'm trying to show systematically with empirical evidence that the official conspiracy theory is simply absurd. Let's take this example. They say, we have all this evidence that it was Al-Qaeda hijackers on the planes. And how do we know that? Because we found a passport of one of the hijackers on Flight 11 that hit the North Tower down on the ground underneath the World Trade Center. So the scenario is, the guy's got his passport in his pocket or in his suitcase, his bag, and just before it hits the building, evidently, they open the window and the passport flies out. Now, you've been in an airplane. Have you ever seen them open the windows when they're going several hundred miles an hour?
I think that would create a disaster.
So how did this passport get out? And then it goes in, creates this huge fireball. Any paper would have been instantly consumed, and yet they're telling us the unsinged passport fell to the ground. With Flight 93, they tell us it came down at about this angle, 580 miles an hour, but there's no plane at the site. They say, well, there's no plane here. Everybody says that. I mean, you've got all these quotations. Everybody goes out there. There's no plane there. There's no wings. There's no tail. You can't see anything. And they say, well, the soil was soft and it was going so fast, it went clear underground. So even the tail section was buried. But out on the ground, you find a red bandana. The hijackers were allegedly wearing red bandanas, and another unsinged passport. So 580 miles an hour, it plunges deep into the ground, and yet somehow the bandana and the passport come out of the airplane and fall on the ground there to be found. See, this is classic false flag operation. And in some of my books, one of my books called Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11. I am a Christian theologian, so I wrote that one specifically for Christians and the churches. And I document that in there, that there's been a long history of false flag operations. That's what imperialist nations do. When you want to attack somebody, you make it look like they've attacked you. So the Japanese, when they wanted to attack Manchuria, they blew up their own railroad, blamed the Chinese. That really started World War II in the Pacific. Hitler did the same thing when he wanted to attack Poland. He dressed up Germans as Polish soldiers, and had them come back across the border, and then he left a dead soldier there with the Polish uniform on, and that was his pretext. He said our attack on Poland was a defensive operation, just like our attack on the Muslim world now is a defensive operation because they attacked us on 9/11.
Well, that's a lot to think about. So historically, this is nothing new.
This is absolutely nothing new. It's just bigger than any false flag operation before.
Real briefly, and of course there is the Northwoods document of 1962. That's been referred to many, many times. How much influence do you think that document may have on what really happened on 9/11?
Well, what it shows us is that's the kind of planning the Pentagon has done in the past. This was a case where America, this was shortly after Castro had taken over Cuba. Cuba, this concept of Cuba for the Cubans, after we had stolen Cuba in the War of 1898. And so the Cubans finally got it back, but we said, no, that's our country. We want it back. So we wanted a pretext. So the Pentagon presented President Kennedy with a set of options, a whole bunch of things. He said, we could do this, we could do this. So it says, we could we could sink a Navy ship and blame the Cubans. This would have been killing American soldiers. So they're not squeamish about sacrificing human lives, American lives, to have a pretext to go to war. And they labeled it pretext for invading Cuba.
Now, before we move on to the new information about 9/11, and I appreciate you bringing that up as well, what do you think are some of the top smoking guns of 9/11 that are never going away, that truly cannot be debunked? One of, first and foremost, is the towers and how they collapse, but there are a couple others as well.
Yeah.
Because I do acknowledge that there is a lot. There are literally hundreds of examples, but they're always the ones that rise to the surface that overshadow the rest.
Obviously, from their point of view, it's Building 7, because they don't want to talk about Building 7. The 9/11 Commission report, 571 pages, doesn't even mention that Building 7, which was a 47-story building, collapsed at 5:20 that afternoon, even though it had not been hit by an airplane, even though it did not have raging fires in it. From the back of the building, you could at most see fires in 2 or 3 floors of the 47 floors. So even if fire could bring down a steel frame high-rise building for the first time in history, there were no big fires in the building. And the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they put out their report on the towers in 2005. And there they blame it on the airplanes. They say they've got a big scenario in which they say, this is how it could have happened. In fact, this is how it did happen. But since no planes hit Building 7, they still have not issued a report. Here we are, almost 6 years after 9/11. The idea that we were attacked by Muslims is used for this so-called war on terror, for clamping down on human rights, civil rights in this country, and for all sorts of things. And yet they've never issued a report showing how Building 7 could have been brought down by the airplanes bringing down the towers. And so that's obviously one that they don't want to deal with. Most Americans, in a poll, only 50% of the American people even knew that Building 7 came down. And let me show you how convincing it is for an expert. Someone showed a video of Building 7 coming down, you know, and it's completely still, and then all of a sudden just comes straight down. That means all 81 vertical columns, steel columns, have to fail simultaneously to have a perfectly symmetrical collapse. That can only be done by explosive, and that's what controlled demolition, the kind called implosion, is all about. So he showed this video to a demolition expert in Holland. He says, "What is that?" The guy said, "Well, obviously, it's a controlled demolition. It's a very expert job," he says. And they say, "Well, that was Building 7 of the World Trade Center." He looks so puzzled. He says, "No, just the Twin Towers came down." "No, a third building came down." "Are you sure? Are you?" When he was finally convinced, he says, "Well, then, those boys know what they were doing, and they were very busy that day." So anybody who knows about these things can look at two professors of engineering in Switzerland. See, in Europe, where you can safely say these things and not lose your job, or your company doesn't lose contracts, it's so obvious. And these two professors at the most prestigious scientific institute in Switzerland have said, with the highest probability, and you know that's scientific speak for meaning absolutely, but they always say with highest probability these buildings were brought down by controlled demolition, by explosives.
Amazing. And I guess another smoking gun which we're leaning off into now is the new NORAD tapes that have been released back in 2006, which cover another smoking gun of 9/11, that is response time from the federal government to the attacks. As far as I understand, that was released to reemphasize the official conspiracy theory as far as its intention, but you don't necessarily believe that it accomplished that. Why so?
What happened was, in the 3 years after 9/11, this was the official story the military was telling us. We were told about all 4 flights before they crashed, but not in time to intercept them. The FAA was so slow that we tried to get there with the 2nd and 3rd flights, the one into the South Tower, the one in the Pentagon, but we couldn't get there in time. Well, early members of the 9/11 Truth Movement did the facts, looked at the empirical evidence, and said, just a minute, even if the FAA had been that slow, you still had time to get there. Your scramble operation works very fast, and these fighter jets can go 1,850 miles an hour if they're F-15s, and you could have gotten there. The 9/11 Commission then, in 2004, changes the story. They say, okay, the first flight, you were notified with 9 minutes, but told the military, you were not notified about the other 3 flights until after they crashed. And the generals were saying, well, yes, we were. And they're saying, no, you're not. We've got tapes here that prove it. And see, tapes can be doctored. And I've talked to 2 air traffic controllers who work for the FAA at the Boston Center, one formerly, one currently. And my book has an enormous amount of new evidence that shows, I think beyond any doubt, these tapes have not only been based on cherry picking, but actually doctoring, manufacturing evidence, because what they say is so contrary to what so much testimony from people you cannot believe were either confused or lying have said. Their stories mesh with each other. The only one that agrees with the NORAD tapes is the NORAD tapes.
Just considering what we've seen about Osama bin Laden and these recurring videotapes of him, and many CIA analysts cannot confirm in any way that these are authentic tapes. In some videos he's holding the microphone with his opposite hand that he normally uses, and in some videos some have claimed that that's not even actually the same person at all based upon the jawline. So there's a lot of things that we don't understand in terms of official information and the credibility of it, and how you can qualify and measure how credible that information is.
Let me give another example. Probably the main pillar of the Al-Qaeda hijacker story are the cell phone calls made from the planes, particularly Flight 93. So this means that calls were being made from 25,000 to 40,000 feet. Cell phone calls. Cell phones, at the technology at that time, couldn't do that. The cell phone signal went out horizontally, not vertically. So there was some leakage, however. So in a small plane, without much insulation, you could get a signal up to 7,000 or 8,000 feet, but not above. In a big plane, not above 1,500 or 2,000 feet. All sorts of pilots and passengers have testified to this. So that was the anecdotal evidence. So one of the members of the 9/11 Truth Movement, Key Dudney, who used to write an article for Scientific American, he's a very well-known Canadian mathematician and computer scientist, he took little planes up and found out that's true. You can't get a signal above 8,000 feet. And so therefore, in an airliner, the idea that airliners got signal above 25, 30, 40,000 feet is just completely impossible. And interestingly, while Popular Mechanics was trying to defend the official story that about 10 calls were made from Flight 93, cell phone calls, the government in the Moussaoui trial was withdrawing the claims silently. They reduced it down to 2 cell phone calls, claimed that all the other calls were made on seatback phones. But if you've seen these movies about Flight 93, you know the story was these people were making cell phone calls.
Let's talk about that movie, United Flight 93, as mentioned in your book, and the person behind the making of the film, I believe the director, and what he may be involved in today in terms of media outreach.
Well, one of the associate producers was Michael Bronner, who wrote the story for Vanity Fair to popularize the 9/11 Commission's new story about the interceptions. And it's very interesting that the military singled him out. He was the only person to be given these tapes because he had shown in producing that movie that he would reliably tell the official story. So one example there, the movie ends by claiming the military was not notified about the hijacking of Flight 93 until after 10:15. I show in my book that all sorts of people, including Dick Cheney himself, said we knew about it far in advance. Dick Clark says he received the shoot-down order about 10 till 10, that is 13 minutes before Flight 93 supposedly crashed. So there was plenty of time to shoot it down. Paul Wolfowitz said, we had a plane on the tail and could have shot it down. The story is so obviously false, and yet they claim, because that's what the tapes say, that's the truth, even though it contradicts all these military and civilian leaders.
Before we move on, David, I do want to ask you about Giuliani and the large body of evidence that now stands challenging Giuliani and what he said about 9/11. In fact, perhaps he may know something in addition to what he's said publicly about 9/11. He's been a staunch reporter of the Bush administration, and he's running for Republican right now of the United States. What evidence do you think there may be linking Giuliani to foreknowledge, at the very minimum, of 9/11?
Well, it's very interesting that he said in an interview with Peter Jennings on ABC that when he was there at their alternative emergency site, that they received word that the towers were going to come down. Now that is astounding. Steel frame high-rise buildings have never collapsed because of fire or external damage or any combination thereof. They've only come down through explosives, and good reason for that. In the core of these buildings were 47 massive steel columns, this big at the bottom, very thick steel. They taper off as they go up, but they're still very thick. And it's just impossible for these to come down for any reason other than explosives. And yet he said, I was told they were going to come down. Then you look to see who it was doing the telling. It was his own people, the Office of Emergency Management. That's his office. Then, when you get to Building 7, which collapses 5:20 that afternoon, they started pulling people out of there about noon, 5 hours in advance. So there were small little fires in there, and some of the firefighters said, why aren't you guys up there putting those little fires out? And they were told the building is going to collapse. You trace that story back, is the Office of Emergency Management, Giuliani's office, that was spreading the word the building is going to collapse.
Let's bring this one issue up. Have you ever found any validity to the claim that there was a substantial amount of wealth or gold that was in WTC 7 or 1 and 2 that was removed? There hasn't been a lot of provable facts necessarily surrounding that claim, so that's why I ask if you have found any evidence indicating that.
I don't know anything about that. I happen now to be the script consultant for Loose Change, The Final Cut, which will be out this September, and there will be nothing in there about gold in the basement. But what was in these towers was an enormous amount of asbestos. And there were reports that it was going to cost $1 billion or more to remove the asbestos. So we can say that it was very convenient for the owners of the buildings. It was very convenient for the city of New York that these buildings come down. And so instead of it costing them billions of dollars, Silverstein makes billions of dollars. And then the really tragic side of this is that after 9/11, the question was it safe to work at Ground Zero? Well, of course it wasn't safe. There were all those very fine asbestos particles in the air. There were stories that said the air quality, I mean, the amount of asbestos is many times higher than what is safe. The EPA was going to say that. The Bush-Cheney White House ordered the EPA to lie, to change its report, to tell people the air is safe to breathe. So many of the workers believed that. They went out there without even a little flimsy mask over their face. Now, more than half of the 40,000 workers at Ground Zero are sick. Some of them already have permanently debilitating lung diseases. Cancer is developing. About 100 people have already died from cancer, and cancer is a very slow developing disease usually. So the fact that so many people have died leads some experts to say far more people will die from the cleanup than died on 9/11 itself.
I've seen a large number of videos, and I'm not really seeing more than a couple frames, and I cannot make out personally whether it is a commercial plane or a missile or a charter plane. And there's a lot of debate over the no-plane theory, even within the 9/11 truth movement. So I'm curious if you can reiterate your stance on the Pentagon and what you think happened there.
I really don't know. The evidence is so contradictory. It's very hard to come up with a coherent theory about what really happened there. But what is not hard, and something we all agree on in the 9/11 truth movement, is that the official story is not true and could not be true. The official story is that Flight 77, under the control of Hani Hanjour, came in, flew back 40 minutes back towards Washington, and then made an amazing 333-degree downward spiral, came in, hit the Pentagon at virtually ground level without scraping the grass, and we've got now so many experts in the 9/11 truth movement. So we have architects and engineers for 9/11 truth, veterans for 9/11 truth, a lot of former officers. But we also have an organization called Pilots for 9/11 truth. They're signing up right and left, 2 or 3 a week joining this organization. And I quote some of them in there saying, I was a commercial pilot. I flew these big birds. I flew 757s. And I don't think with my 35 years experience I could have done that. I know Hani Hanjour, who could not fly a Piper Club safely. I mean, he was known as a terrible pilot. There's no doubt about that. People wouldn't go, instructors wouldn't go up with him a second time saying, you can't fly, you're too dangerous. And yet we're supposed to believe he got into this huge airplane, which he had never flown before, and then did this amazing trick. These pilots say, that is just too ridiculous to even take seriously. And yet that's the official story. So we know right there the official story is false. That's all we need. That's all we need to demand an investigation, and then we can find out what. Another fact, in doing that loop, he came in and hit wedge 1. Why would anyone go out of their way to hit wedge 1? It was the place that had been reinforced. So less damage was done than hitting any other part of the Pentagon. Also, the renovation wasn't finished, so people hadn't gone back to their offices. Many more people would have been killed striking anywhere else. Furthermore, these guys, if they hated the American military policy, they would have wanted to go after the Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, and the top brass. They were all safely on the opposite side of the Pentagon. So we can say these guys, if they were so brilliant to outfox the American military defense system, they would have not chosen to hit wedge 1. So again, the official story is simply absurd.
So just as a brief overview, we're talking about Hani Hanjour, which supposedly cannot speak very good English, did not have contact in any way, shape, or form that we know of with the FAA while hijacking the plane. So what exactly did he do with this plane in a matter of seconds in terms of maneuvering itself into that particular part of the Pentagon?
All they say is he did it. And If you read Popular Mechanics, they try to defend the official story. And they say, sure, Hani wasn't a great pilot, but you know, all he had to do was get in and punch it, put it on automatic pilot, put in the directions, and it would have taken itself back to Washington, D.C. He only flew it manually the last 8 minutes. Well, it's the last 8 minutes in which he did the impossible. They don't even discuss that. They don't discuss, could he have flown that, brought it in at ground level, and not scraped. That's the complete dishonesty of this and all the other reports that try to defend the official story.
Right, exactly. So here we are, nearly 6 years after 9/11, and there are more people than ever questioning the official story of 9/11, yet there is some frustration that I'm feeling, that I'm getting through emails, over whether it's actually creating the change that we're looking for, and that, for most of us, is not simply impeachment, but criminal prosecution of not only Bush, but many associates as well. And my question to you is, why have you maintained that the focus stay on 9/11?
Well, I haven't maintained that everybody's focus should stay on it.
Right.
There are so many things to be dealing with.
In terms of your research.
But in my own work, I could say for the last 5 years, I have spent, last 4 years, I should say, I have spent probably 95% of my time dealing with 9/11. I've written 5 books, you could even say 6 books on it. I've written a lot of articles, I've made lots of DVDs, given lots of lectures. Why is 9/11 so important? Bill Christensen, former CIA agent, answers that, and I repeat his answer in my book. He says, I went for almost 5 years not looking at the evidence for the alternative conspiracy theory. Finally, when something led me to do it, I looked at it, and now I've spent months of agony reassessing, and now I say it's obvious the official story is false. And he says this is the most important thing to be dealing with, because if you talk about the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the pulling back of civil rights with the Patriot Act, and now we've just had Bush sign a document really declaring himself a dictator. If there's another major calamity in the United States, he's just signed a presidential directive saying he will have sole authority to direct what goes on in this country. Dictatorial powers. It's all based on 9/11. 9/11 has been the pretext for all of this. Every time Bush gets in trouble on something, he appeals to 9/11. Even when he's talking about Iraq, he says, we've got to defeat the terrorists there. They're the ones who attacked us on 9/11. Even though everybody knows that's false, he keeps appealing to it. So until we reveal the truth about 9/11, it's going to be very difficult to get our focus on other issues, particularly the overriding issue of our time, which is our relationship to the rest of nature, which is manifesting itself now in human-caused global warming. We're in danger of runaway global warming within this century, and once that starts, there's no stopping it. That'll be the end of civilization. And we can't focus on it because we have to put all our energy into the so-called war on terror.
I think what you're saying is very key in terms of 9/11 was not blowback. It was not simply the result of bad foreign policy, but was possibly, as the evidence indicates, a direct result of government involvement.
That's right. And the first year and a half, I believed it was blowback. So I started writing a book on U.S. imperialism. And it was a year and a half before I woke up. So I don't blame people who don't accept our theories yet, because I was very slow. I didn't know anything about steel frame high-rise buildings. I didn't know the details about the Pentagon attack. I didn't know that Hani Hanjour couldn't fly a plane. I just didn't look at the evidence, and when you don't look at the evidence, you can say, oh, that's a crazy conspiracy theory. But once you look at the evidence, you see ours is the only theory, insofar it's a theory, that makes any sense, and the official theory is the one that is absolutely nuts.
What I've noticed in the mainstream media when it comes to how they label something a wacky conspiracy theory or a wacky conspiracy theorist, as they may call you on Fox, my question to you is, how many of them do you think actually know the truth about what may have happened about 9/11 and that are actually psychologically so afraid? I know this is a speculative question, but they are also exposed to a lot more information that you and I are also exposed to at some of the higher levels in the world of journalism and access to information. So how many of those, in terms of the Limbaughs, the O'Reillys, and the Savages, actually suspect the official story themselves, but are too terrified to ask the real questions for fear of losing their job or title in the world?
I really don't know. The ones I wonder more about are the more mainstream reporters and the people who write the reports. Do they know? We know that, for example, NBC interviewed William Rodriguez, the last person out of the North Tower, and they interviewed him. He's telling his story about hearing explosions in the building long before the tower came down. And NBC came to his home and filmed him and interviewed him. Not 1 second of that interview has ever appeared. So it makes you wonder, do they know they're deliberately participating in a cover-up? I just don't know. Mm-hmm. What I do know is that if we could get the mainstream press to start looking at the evidence, the official story would be all over. I begin my book by saying the evidence that 9/11 was an inside job is overwhelming. The problem is simply to get people to look at the evidence, including journalists. And then I give a lot of reasons why people don't look at the evidence, excuses they give. They've got a priori objections. Oh, our government wouldn't do such a thing. Or if all those people had been involved, somebody would have talked. And instead of looking at the evidence, they use those as excuses not to look at it. If we could ever get them to look at the evidence, then it's so obvious.
So for a lot of people out there that are already what you would call, quote, the choir, what would you recommend to some of them that are going through some of this frustration about how they can get involved if they're not already a writer, a journalist, a blogger, or a broadcaster in terms of getting information out about 9/11 or other related issues?
I end the book by suggesting various ways that 9/11 truth might become a public event, that is, a source of public discussion. So I think it may be that we need a million-person march on Washington. So if you get that many people, it is difficult for the mainstream media to ignore it. They do a good job. They belittle it. They say, oh, it's not really a million. They couldn't get as many as they want. But nevertheless, they have to cover it. And I've suggested other things. We need citizens committees. I've suggested that Canada could do this. European countries can do it. We can do it here. Get some very high-level respected citizens who have not made a judgment about 9/11 one way or the other, and say, we will come and present our evidence, then let the 9/11 Commission, the government, popular mechanics, whoever wants to come and defend the official story, give their rebuttal, attempted rebuttal to what we say, and then render a judgment. And we know what that judgment will be if it is a fair jury. And that sort of thing with very prestigious people, it might be difficult for the mainstream media to ignore that. So that's something people can do in their local areas. You know, each state, some of the big cities could have such a jury. Some have happened already, but a lot more of them would be a very good thing.
I've heard about a variety of groups doing something called the 11th of every month, where people in their local community walk around with signs and do outreach in their own areas on the 11th of every month, and that's been happening incrementally nationwide, even in this city. So here you are in Portland, a very progressive city, to talk about some of these hard-hitting issues tonight at Portland State University.
Yes, and I'm going to speak on 9/11. Let's get empirical. And I end by suggesting that I really think my new book, Debunking 9/11, Debunking, can be a great aid to activists because it gives a lot more information than before about just how obviously false the official story is.
You just came from Seattle, speaking there on the 18th. What was the turnout like, and what was also the response that you got from the local media there in terms of trying to contact you and do interviews with you, basically?
And prior to that, I was in Vancouver, British Columbia.
Okay.
And there we had about 900 people turn out. We had a lot more media attention. Therefore, so I was on a couple TV shows. I was even on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Again, outside the United States, it's easier to get on mainstream television. So I've been on mainstream television in Europe, in England, in Canada, just not in the United States, except one little brief appearance on Tucker Carlson's show, where he mainly screamed at me and called me sinful for suggesting these things.
Sinful?
Sinful theologian, yes. So, and in Seattle we had, I don't know what the count was, 500, something like that.
Oh, wait, I think I remember the sub-headline. They use these sub-headlines. Why does the church hate? is that correct?
I don't know, but
interesting.
The turnout is amazing. The interest is growing, and as I say, the most important thing is this influx into the movement of people with technical expertise. So it's not just a bunch of us with humanities expertise, but people with architectural, engineering, military, airplane piloting, CIA, and all of these people joining in the movement and saying the official story simply can't be true.
Last question, and probably one of the most important. After all this time, after all you hear about concentration camps, a surveillance society, a police state, why are you still unafraid to speak the truth?
I have a flippant answer to that, which is that people say, aren't you worried? And I say, well, you know, there are two choices. They can take me out or they can leave me alone. If they leave me alone, I finally get to write my systematic theology and enjoy my old age and my grandkids. But if they take me out, all my 9/11 books go to #1 on the bestseller list. So it's a win-win situation.
David Ray Griffin, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Alex.